Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, distinguished colleagues, Professor Brague, Madame Brague. Bienvenue, bonsoir. Welcome to you all. Welcome this evening to McGill University's Faculty of Religious Studies and to the first of the two lectures in the 2012 Birks Lecture Series. I am Professor Ellen Aitken, Dean of the Faculty of Religious Studies, and this year we celebrate the 62nd year since the establishment of the Birks Lectures, a series that has in so many ways explored the diversity of the world's religions, their local expressions, interactions, and histories. The Birks Lectures are an annual series established for the Faculty of Religious Studies in 1950 through the generosity of the late William Massey Birks, shortly after the establishment of the faculty. William Massey Birks' vision and passion for the study of theology in innovative and transformative ways guided the formation of the Ecumenical Consortium of Theological Colleges in Montreal as early as 1912, the first such in North America. Mr. Birks was the chairman of the joint boards of the colleges at the time of the building of this building and the gift of it in 1931. And it was again William Massey Birks who, with what is described as an irrepressible spirit, was the catalyst in conversations with Cyril James, the then principal of McGill in 1940. Conversations that led to the founding in 1948 of the Faculty of Divinity in McGill. The name was changed to the Faculty of Religious Studies in the 1960s. I would note also that some of you here have or are currently, those of you who have been graduate students in the faculty, you've held Birks fellowships or won Birks prizes. And I want to take this opportunity here, particularly to honor the memory, the vision, and the passion of William Massey Birks and the Birks family, and to express on behalf of the faculty and the university our gratitude for gifts that in so many ways have strengthened and enabled our work. And I believe that Jonathan and Maria Birks will be joining us at some point this evening. By their mandate, the Birks Lectures are to be given by distinguished scholars in the fields of religious studies. The first lecturer was the Right Reverend Leslie Hunter, Bishop of Sheffield, and a theologian in the Christian social gospel tradition. More recent lecturers have included Houston Smith, Northrop Frye, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Ninian Smart, Gregory Baum, Jürgen Moltmann, Robert McAfee Brown, Christer Stendhal, James Barr, Charles Adams, Douglas John Hall, John Hick, John Levinson, David Little, Azim Nanji, Bernadette Bruton, Harvey Cox, John Hawley, Oliver O'Donovan, Jan Assmann, and Donald Lopez. We note with sadness this evening the recent death, earlier this fall, of Gabriel Bahanian, who was the Birks lecturer in 2008. As you will surmise from this list of names, the topics have ranged widely from biblical studies to comparative religions, from questions of religion and modern culture to classical topics in Christian theology. Indeed, the sequence of Birks lectures over the past 62 years provides a window of insight into the quite distinctive history of this faculty. Professor Rémi Brague not only joins this catalogue of scholars, his presence here tonight also highlights the vital role that the study of philosophy and interfaith studies play in the life of this faculty, as sites for exploring the countless questions that lie at the heart of the study of religion for all of us, no matter what our fields. Following this evening's lecture, there will be a reception downstairs in the lobby to which you are all most cordially invited and where you will have an opportunity to greet Professor Brague. I'd also point out that if you're feeling crowded or if you see people coming in, there are additional seats in the balcony up above, and if we get desperate too, some seats behind the speaker. And now I give you my colleague, Professor Professor Gaël Fias, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and in the Department of Philosophy, to introduce Professor Brague.
Welcome everybody, it's my pleasure to see so many of you here tonight for Professor Rémi Brague's lecture. By way of introduction, let me say a few words about Professor Brague. Professor Brague, we thank you warmly for being with us tonight. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you. As it was said in the McGill press, you wear several hats, even though you do not like to wear them. French philosopher, emeritus at La Sorbonne University in Paris, you currently hold a chair in philosophy in Germany at the Ludwig Maximilian University. Multilingual, you have also taught at Spanish and Italian universities, and of course, you are also familiar with North America, since you have taught at several prestigious American universities. You have translated texts from German, English, Arab, and Hebrew. The scope of your writings and teaching is extremely impressive. Your books have been translated into almost 20 languages. They concern ancient Roman and Greek philosophy, medieval Jewish and Arab philosophy, contemporary questions of meaning, and the history of law and culture in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. As a philosopher, you are also well known for your British sense of humor, if I can say that to a Frenchman, and for your humility. It's thus with great pleasure and a bit of curiosity that we wish to hear you discuss the question atheism cannot answer, and tomorrow be as a command at the same hour. You are all welcome. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we first express my most heartfelt thanks to, sorry, I have to switch on this horrible contraption. Well, let me then renew my most heartfelt gratitude to all the people who made this possible, to the people who invited me here at McGill. And well, I have to beg your pardon if I feel some stage pride after the list of those big fish who had this chair before me. And some of them are known to me, some are among my friends. Anyway, I try to do my best. And first, let me blurt out my thesis. The thesis in favor of which I should like to argue is the following one: Atheism has failed. Hence, it is doomed to disappear in the long run. Our task consists in bringing this fact to consciousness and in drawing the consequences that it brings about. When so doing, I often get the impression, to my own eyes, of belaboring the obvious. But now the problem is that the majority of our contemporaries don't accept to face it, and we live among various attempts at camouflaging it. Now, you must ask, is he really serious? Well, against my thesis, we are tempted to utter a powerful videtur quod non. This is Latin for bullshit. Would it not be more accurate to speak of the triumphal march of atheism? This is the way in which many atheists see the situation. Polls show that the number of church attendance is plummeting, at least in Europe, i.e. in countries that bear the stamp of Christianity. This is too obvious for me to waste time repeating it. To be sure, religions know today an unexpected comeback, especially in the most radical forms. For instance, in the most spectacular, because violent way in Islam, but in Hinduism as well. This happens also in a more peaceful guise in groups such as the Haredim in Judaism or in Christianity among the so-called evangelical Christians. Well, the answer of atheists is ready. All this are rearguard battles. The progress of science and of technology that is narrowly linked up with it brings about irresistibly a secularization of life. We only have to be patient. Europe is the avant-garde. The rest of the world will follow suit. What lends this hope some grade of plausibility is the fact that, on the level of society, atheism carries the day. In his Thoughts on the French Affairs, that he wrote as soon as December 1791, Edmund Burke made the point that atheists have given up their traditional bashfulness and shifted to a more outspoken and even more provocative attitude. Quote, "Boldness formerly was not the character of the theists as such, but of late they are grown active, designing, turbulent, and seditious." Unquote. Nowadays, after 2 centuries, he would express himself more forcefully. Among the leading minds of late modernity, there were many atheists who advertised for their unbelief and attacked religion. The names of Birks, Freud, and Nietzsche are in all memories. Today, we have to do with people whose intellectual quality is not a match against the 3 giants whom I have just mentioned, but they are noisier and receive the mass media a larger echo. Furthermore, spectacular successes are very much to the credit of atheism. Let me mention 2 big examples, one from the theoretical and one from the practical realm. First, on the theoretical level, modern physical science, written in mathematical language, to quote Galilei, succeeded in putting forward a description of reality that has no need of the God hypothesis, to allude to the well-known dialogue between the astronomer Laplace and Apollo. The personal piety of many scientists doesn't play any role in this matter. When they do physics, they work without reference to God as a stopgap. You recognize Dietrich Bonhoeffer's well-known phrase. By this token, one need not religion, or no more religion, when one looks for an explanation of the world. Let me here add a qualification. It is already dubious to understand religion in general as an explanation of physical phenomena. As such, there is little doubt that a scientific worldview is far more efficient, but one is allowed to ask whether any religion ever intended to do that. Some scientists and journalists who toy with a smattering of science short-sightedly imagine religion to have been some sort of physics still in infancy. Yet, the study of the worldview of the so-called primitive peoples shows that they hardly care for the structure of the world, let alone for its causes or for the way it came into existence. And in later religions, one could quote utterances of the Buddha, who discarded every question of cosmology as useless, or even, for that matter, the Talmud. The second success. On the practical level, modern political thought and practice succeeded in showing that societies can organize themselves without a superhuman principle of legitimacy. As soon as 1682, the French philosopher Pierre Bayle defended his famous paradox, according to which atheism is not more dangerous for the state than superstition, and even that a society of atheists would be more docile than one of religious enthusiasts. Our societies made of this intuition or wager a concrete reality, each in its own style, from the American wall of separation to the French laïcité, and so on and so forth. On this point too, I would like to qualify things. Not all religions want to foist on society a model of order. In particular, Christianity distinguishes itself from the former religions insofar as it doesn't impose on people other rules of conduct as the ones that natural, unaided reason either discovered or could have discovered. Be that as it may, on balance, we may conclude that in order to orient ourselves in the material world and in social organization, we need no religion. Therefore, some sort of atheism is possible. Let me now make two observations on this kind of atheism. First, such an atheism is not necessarily militant, necessarily belligerent, as an aggressive conviction. It exists, first and foremost, as a methodological principle that the divine must be put into brackets. The word agnosticism was coined exactly for this purpose by the English natural scientist and indefatigable advocate of Darwin's doctrine of evolution, Thomas Huxley. In Victorian England, atheism was hardly a thing. Therefore, in the course of a discussion held in 1869 at a metaphysical society, Huxley suggested that his own position should be named agnosticism. Second point, agnosticism doesn't represent a position that concerns religious questions only, such as God's existence. An analogous stance of modesty and soberness is to be found when what is at stake is our knowledge of physical phenomena. The positivism of Auguste Comte and of Claude Bernard makes of the renunciation to an insight into the ultimate causes a basic principle. Scientific inquiry should content itself with expressing the relations that obtain between the phenomena in the most precise way with the help of mathematical language. Why what is what it is. Why it is how it is, science is not allowed to ask. In the teeth of all its successes, atheism, even in its mildest form, agnosticism I've just been alluding to, atheism contains a lethal drawback, a sickness unto death. For there is a question on which atheism hasn't anything to say, but is more, it grounds itself in the decision to give up any possibility of answering this question. This fundamental question is the following one. If we admit that there is on this earth a being known as Homo sapiens, a being that is able to give an account of the universe that surrounds him, and to live peacefully with his fellow men without having to look up towards any transcendent reality, that would it be good that such a being should be and keep existing? To put it otherwise, we can sketch a merely immanent description of physical reality that enables human beings to conquer the world and to exploit it for their own advantage. We need not uncover the ultimate truth about reality as long as the description we make of it works. We can set rules for the living together of the human beings in a merely immanent way. It is enough for us to conceive of a compact through which human beings lay on themselves the duty to spare each other because it is in their interest to do so. The German philosopher Kant even said that a political problem is solvable even in a society of devils, provided they are intelligent. The ultimate goal of the mastery of nature through technology and of the social organization through politics is that mankind should go on existing and even improve its lot. Now, the question whether such an existence and or progress is something we should wish and foster, this question remains unanswered and even not asked. For this reason, atheism has no answer and can't have any. In order to substantiate this claim, I must here venture some words on the self-defeating character of atheism. I say self-defeating because the failure of atheism is a direct consequence of its success, i.e. of what I've just been sketching. By this token, we may be allowed to speak of a dialectics of atheism in the same meaning as in the well-known dialectics of enlightenment of Adorno and Horkheimer. Yet, whereas the two masters of the School of Frankfurt remained on the level of ideas, we have to do here with a dialectics that could take utterly concrete features. Let me give here a brief outline of this dialectic. The project of modern atheism consisted in bringing about an emancipation of man. Man was to decide on his own destiny. He had to give his own law to himself, which we somehow loosely call autonomy. In former times, this was not the case. This was not even possible if we have to trust the way in which the modern project tells its own story. Man had to set his or her life according to principles that lie outside of him or her. The overarching principle was, in some cases, the beautiful order of the cosmos. This is a phrase that boils down to a tautology, because cosmos means precisely a beautiful order. The beautiful order of the cosmos that man had to imitate. It was in other cases, that this overarching principle, was in other cases a divine law which man had to go by. I happen to have written a book on each of those two possibilities. But the 2 points of reference are intertwined. The God who emits the commands is at the same time the God who gave the world its order. The legislator is the same as the creator. Now, modern times refuse more and more decidedly to look in those two directions. Their ideal would be to let man rest on a human basis only, so that any reference to an outside, to an other, to an higher being would be excluded or even become meaningless. To put it as the young Karl Marx, the root of man is man himself. He says that, trying to define in a mild etymological pun the adjective radical. radicalism means that we have to look for the root, and the root is absent. The 19th century has minted for this idea a name that is to be read in the young Karl Marx too, humanism. The word has several meanings. As a category for historians, it designates the movement of rediscovery and reappropriation of the heritage of classical literatures that began in 14th century Italy. Concretely, the leaders of this movement, say Petrarca, were no enemies of religion, but on the contrary, pious persons. Yet, it is interesting to observe that the making of the word as a category of historiography took place at the same time as the use of the same word to express some sort of declaration of independence of man towards God, i.e. in the early 40s of the 19th century. Humanism, as an epoch and as the renewal of interest in classical antiquity, was introduced into academic parlance probably by the German historians Karl Heinrich Wilhelm Hagen. And humanism, as the exclusive attention given to human beings, is to be read in the left-wing Hegelian Arnold Ruge, then in Feuerbach, Proudhon, and so on. Now, this humanism, precisely because it does not admit any higher instance than man, is unable to pass judgment on the value, or lack of it, of man as such. Man can't possibly speak either in favor of him or herself or against him or herself. As a matter of course, it is very much likely that man would take a positive view of the existence of man, but such an acquittal would be utterly worthless. In a lecture he gave right after the last World War, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre brought this out by poking fun at an utterance of the poet, another Frenchman, Jean Cocteau. The French multifaceted painter and writer was seated in an aircraft that flew above some mountainous chain. He admired the landscape and still more the inventive mind of man, so that he exclaimed, "Man is terrific." This may be true, but Sartre asks, who is speaking? Certainly neither a dog nor a horse, hence not an unbiased umpire, but a man. Now it is clear that nobody can judge on him or herself objectively. The question I asked above, i.e., is this good that there should be men? This question might be whisked away as merely academic. This would be the case if two new elements had not been on the stage for some decades now. First, man is at present in possession of the possibility of doing away with himself. The question about suicide exists since the earliest times. It received a theoretical treatment in Stoic philosophy. What is new is that the problem has taken a collective dimension. The human species is now able to commit an all-encompassing suicide. It possesses the means that could bring this about. Let me mention here three of these means. First, since the beginning of industrialization, man has been spoiling the environment. This could lead to a situation in which the existence of man would become utterly impossible. Second, since the discovery of atom energy and of its possible military use, man possesses the faculty to wipe himself out in a moment through an all-out nuclear war. 3. With new means of chemical contraception, each generation can freely decide whether there will be a next generation or none at all. This third possibility would be peaceful, piecemeal, hence hardly visible. In contradistinction to the second example, atomic warfare, but exactly as in the first, i.e. about pollution and the environment, this end of mankind would not be foisted on it from above, for instance, by a state that would launch into atomic warfare. It would be the result of a daily plebiscite in which each individual would be free to choose. In a long footnote to his Confession of the Curate of Savoy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau takes up the comparison that already had become hackneyed between fanaticism and atheism. He rounds it up with a pithy formula, quote, its principles, and he means the principles of atheism, don't cause the death of people, but they prevent them from being born. We may observe that atheistic regimes of the 20th century produced mass murders on a far larger scale than religious wars did. But Rousseau was fortunate not to know. But let us admit, for the sake of argument, that this be true. Rousseau goes on. To be sure, fanaticism lets blood flow, but it prompts people to great enterprises. That's a rather strange idea. On the other hand, atheism, even if it does not kill anybody, reveals itself as being more lethal in the long run. So much for the first of the two newly occurred elements that change the terms of the problem. With a second new element, we make a step further. Annihilation, extinction, that already had shifted from merely logical possibility to real possibility, becomes a temptation. Well, a logical possibility is what is not contradictory. A real possibility is that the causes of which are real, whether they are active, whether they are on or off, is another question. But the causes are there. We have atomic weapons. We have industrial pollution. We have chemical, very refined contraception. We could do away with ourselves. Then the second element that brings about some sort of temptation simply to, well, call it a day with human adventure. Man calls in doubt his or her legitimacy. We are no longer sure that it is good there should be men. We can look at this once again from 3 points of view, and I'll be very brief. First, man is not convinced any longer that he or she has the right to conquer and exploit the earth. Second, man is not convinced any longer of his or her superiority over against the other living beings. 3, man is not even sure that he or she distinguishes him or herself from other living beings by radically different features. There is no quality leap, according to some biologists or zoologists, between men and, say, bonobo apes. As a matter of course, we very well could content ourselves to imagine that survival instinct will look after man and ensure the existence of the species. This may have been the case in former times. It is highly probable that man as a species will carry on existing because people will keep reproducing themselves. But Schopenhauer tried to show that sexual instinct is hardly more than a trap through which the will to live fools us without giving a damn about the happiness of individuals. Can we answer him? The trouble is, in any case, that the appeal to instinct would do away with the whole project of enlightenment. I don't mean thereby only the movement that became conscious of itself and gave itself this name in 18th century Europe. I mean the project of philosophy in the whole breadth of its achievements. I've been told that on the poster that announces my lecture, an unknown hand scribbled, instead of the question that Atheism can't answer, the question that Atheism need not bother to answer. This is exactly the kind of attitude that I am attacking here, i.e., not paying attention to the question and, putting one's trust in the irrational survival instincts, or alleged instincts of the human species. This would mean to give up the project of philosophy, a project which is as old as Socrates, and his endeavor to set to task every professional man to compel him to show his competence, which was to take place by his explaining why exactly he does what he does. Professional people had to give an account. In Greek, logon didona. The enterprise went further and enlarged itself into a project of asking for the ground of each and every phenomenon. In metaphysics, Leibniz put it on the throne by formulating the principle of reasoning. On the level of European modern history, this held true mainly for the institutions. Every statutory order, every social system and organization had to stand in the dock in front of the court of reason and to show its credentials. The question being, to put it with Kant, whether it could stand the free and public examination of reason. Generally meaning, every action without exception should be, in principle, justified by reasons. Now, are we allowed to give up the quest for a ground when what is at stake is the very being of mankind? If we did that, we would have to face something unbearable. We would entrust the existence of the only being who can be the carrier of reason to unreason. We meet here a paradox that is already pointed out on another level. Natural science represents a fantastic triumph of reason, but at the same time it claims to show that reason is merely a product, a byproduct, an unintentional byproduct, an epiphenomenon of evolution, that is, of a movement that was led by blind and irrational forces. But with a second paradox I've just been bringing out, we would be in a still worse predicament. If reason stems from unreason, we can hardly reproach her for that. It's not her fault. But in the case that I'm dealing with now, reason would sort of commit suicide and high treason against herself. Most concretely, we hear everywhere that the best way to hamper the so-called population explosion that some people still fear is education, and especially school for girls. This may be true, but what is in any case above any doubt is that such a method is morally far superior to compulsory measures like sterilization. And it is possible and even highly probable that it works better too. Well, we can deduce from this very nice observation a rather unpleasant consequence. The more intelligent, the more learned is a human group, the more barren it must be. Or conversely, the more stupid and ignorant, the more fruitful. Present-day European demography furnishes us with an almost experimental proof of this equation. It is probably not by chance that the decrease in birth rates affects Europe, and there the educated bourgeoisie, and in the rest of the world, the countries and the social classes that are supposed to be the most progressive. Now, mind you, I'm not claiming that the shrinking of religious faith in Europe or elsewhere could be the cause of the lower birth rates. Looking for causes is already in itself a dubious endeavor. Historians are always reluctant to do that. But, admitted one does, one has to take one's bearing from the fact that such causes most probably are a tangled skein of factors that influence each other, and so on and so forth. In order to see more clearly in this maze, one could and should mobilize sociology, psychology, economy, all fields in which I have no competence. I would like here to draw upon a very old, very classic distinction, the one between cause and ground, or reason if you prefer. A fact has causes. An action has grounds. A cause explains what is the case already. A ground concerns what we can bring about in the future. If one could discover the causes of an action, this action wouldn't be free any longer. It wouldn't be an action any longer, by the way, but rather a mechanism. Finally, where does the lower birth rates among educated people come from, and where they lead, is for me a matter of indifference. For what we desperately need here is not an explanation, but a reason for us to act. We absolutely must be able to tell why the existence of men on this earth is a good thing. If the project of enlightenment is to be successful, man needs a ground for man to go on existing. And to do that as man in the full meaning of the term, i.e. as a rational and free being, and not only as a biped without feathers, to allude to the well-known quip of Diogenes against Plato. Man is in need of a point of reference that can legitimate his existence on the earth, which doesn't mean, mind out, that it legitimates each of man's whims, and certainly not the ruthless explanation of the planet. The existence of a superhuman instance that can affirm the existence of the human species is the first content of religion. This instance is, to quote Aquinas' famous formula, at the end of each of the 5 paths, the viae, that lead us to acknowledge God's existence, what we loosely call proofs of God's existence, he calls this quod omnes nominant Deum. This is what everybody calls by the name of God. Now, to be quite concrete and matter-of-fact, we need a category of human beings who can bring together in harmony faith and reason. Faith, because they must have an Archimedean point, an external, transcendent reference point from which the existence of the human species can become legitimate. And we need people who can bring reason together in order that the species that would not be made possible by this way would be really human and not simply, featherless like pets, like I told you. We need such a category, such a human type, not in order to make human life more beautiful, not as an oil of sorts that could make social life easier, could make the social machine hum better. Those are, by the way, two arguments that were often put forward by apologetics. We need religion in order to have a good society. We need religion to have some aesthetic sense, to encounter the beautiful, things like that. I am therefore more radical. We need that in order to ensure the continuation of the human adventure. As a catchword, and to be sure not without a touch of irony, I would suggest we need a new Middle Ages. We should bid farewell to the modern attempt to weigh anchors away from the Middle Ages. I mean, we need real Middle Ages, and in no case the caricature that modern times had to draw in order to justify themselves. We need a Middle Ages that take up the achievements of modern times in a positive way and integrates them in a new synthesis. Medieval studies become a wholly actual field. For the problems with which the Middle Ages had to struggle are still ours. I'm not pleading in favor of a getting back to. No getting back to is worthwhile. But rather, I would plead, in this case, to quote a well-known phrase, a hermeneutic of continuity. The question isn't any longer whether we can do without God, but rather with what kind of God we shall have to live if we want mankind to live on. The God of the Bible and of the Christians is not the only possible one. There are besides him the God of other religions, the God or gods of neo-pagan or para-pagan movements, and into the bargain the God whom Pascal called the God of the philosophers and other scientists. But my hunch is that the God of the Bible and of the Christians could be a very good candidate. Well, this is another story. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Brague, for this very interesting lecture. So I guess that we'll have many questions and we have time for it, so that's a good news. So please raise your hand and be sure that's a question and not a comment, please. Yes?
I'm sure it's a question. It's a recollection of 2 points that you made. The first one being that, of that little point you made about Sartre and what he said about the poet that was biased in his nature about the observation. And as well the point that you made about that scribbling that someone wrote, that why bother ask that question. Do you not think that it could be a slight leap in one's line of reasoning to assume that if a side or a stance like theism poses a question that by its own nature is skewed, such that the other side need not bother to ask that question, to answer that question, in the sense that you mentioned at Sartre, he said that why would you bother observing something when you are swayed, in the sense that a human might be swayed, especially since you made a point in your lecture where you're indifferent towards a certain question of the decreasing birth rates. Why would we assume that that side is wrong? Why would we assume that there's a failure on behalf of that side, especially since you're aware that, for example, an atheist can ask a theist the question of, can God create a boulder too heavy to lift? The reason why we succeed in answering that as theists is we say, why bother answer that question when its very nature defies the premise that we make for God, the definition that we set for God. So finally, my question is this. Why is a failure of a side to answer a question that by its own nature is swayed a failure of that side in entirety?
Well, I'm awfully sorry that there are problems of acoustics. I understand perhaps every second word as far as I understood. Your question means, well, your question is a way, in my opinion, to reformulate the objection I've made to myself. Do we really need a reason to go on? Was this your point? Or perhaps not exactly.
The two sides that disagree on something have different.
Is that the microphone? I'm sorry.
If two sides disagree on something, sometimes it's because they have premises that negate each other. So, for example, an atheist would assume that there cannot possibly be a God, and a theist presumes a God by its definition that if they ask a certain question like why should we continue existing, its question basically is swayed in its nature. That if an atheist were to answer that question, they would have to have the same premises as the theist. But I'm saying, how can we make a question compatible to both sides that by their very nature are in opposition?
I'm not sure to have been able to go to the bottom of your question. Perhaps let me rephrase a point in my talk. And perhaps I'll begin with telling you a personal remembrance. Well, I was given the opportunity to discuss this question. I was given the opportunity to discuss this question with a person whom I need not name, that's rather well known. I was surprised. He defines himself as secular, it's the new idiom, instead of the Victorian equivalence of atheism, like agnosticism, humanism, and so on. Now, secularism is Victorian too, by the way. It was launched by Holy Hoke in the 60s. And well, he understands himself as a staunch supporter. But let's take this fellow as a human type, that the name is irrelevant here. Let's say a staunch supporter of the Enlightenment, who understands him or herself as secular, and who answers an objection of the same kind, like the one I've just been making against atheism, I say, well, nature will do that. Why shouldn't we leave nature do what she wants, metaphorically speaking? I was really surprised to have to listen from the lips of such a person this kind of argument, which defeats the search for arguments, which is the usual ploy of Enlightenment thinkers. How can you justify what you are doing? let's think of the revolutionaries, and first of all, of the people who were the intellectual harbingers of the revolution in France. You know, how is it that there is a king? There must be a reason for a member of this family to be king, and not anybody else, and so on. When we look for reasons, we have to be able to give good reason. This is almost a tautology. A reason must always be a good reason. A bad reason is no reason at all. And how should we leave the care for the survival of the human species to such a mythical figure as nature? Why should we give up the search for reasons where what is at stake is the very existence of the only being that can ask for reasons? This would make reason dependent on the irrational. And this is why I call this attitude, suicide, intellectual suicide, and even high treason, in contradistinction to the other paradox that I stumbled upon in science, which is the highest achievement of human reason in its accurate description of nature, that leads us to imagine or to believe, I don't know, that reason itself is a product of something irrational. But in this case, i.e. reason being produced by the irrational, nobody or nothing is to blame. It simply so happened, and reason was not an accomplice in this this dirty genealogy, those not very dignified ancestors. But in the case that I'm trying to make here, reason would simply let herself drop, would give up its claims at a search for good arguments. Now, another question, perhaps lying in ambush behind the question is, well, why should we go on? Perhaps the answer is negative. It might be better for mankind to disappear by voluntary extinction so that something different can arise. And this is something that we can hear in some cases, for instance, when people say, well, above mankind there is the goddess Earth, to whom they give a Greek name, Gaia. There are such people, and they have arguments. I don't say they have good arguments, but they have arguments. What I'm trying to do is to show in a merely Darwinistic way why we need religion. If religion is the necessary condition for the survival of the human species, then there is no question any longer. Irreligious people, irreligious groups will simply die out. And so my question is, what kind of religion will there be? Will we have a stupid religion? Or will we have a more enlightened one? This is, in my opinion, the real issue. Sorry to be that blunt.
We will welcome other questions, but please, if you could come to the microphone.
Yes,
and so also, if the next one can be prepared to jump in. Do we have another question? Please come here. Thank you. Yeah, sure. So I forgot to mention that questions both in French and in English are welcome.
Monsieur Brague, je suis déjà à traiter de conférences aujourd'hui, donc votre attention sur moi fait que j'ai vraiment du mal à présenter mes idées clairement. En fait, j'entrevois votre démarche comme la proposition d'un renouveau métaphysique qui, justement, est d'autant plus révolutionnaire que la métaphysique n'est pas à la mode, puis qu'on considère que ce vocabulaire-là, qu'on pourrait considérer en tant qu'athée, que ce vocabulaire-là ou ces questions-là doivent tout simplement disparaître. Et j'envisage votre démarche comme une invitation à une forme de métaphysique qui, justement, serait capable de prendre tout ce qui a été réalisé jusqu'au bout de notre civilisation, en termes de sciences et de techniques, justement, sans les jugements de valeur habituels qu'on entend, et avec une proposition, justement, que l'humanité, non seulement se légitime, mais se transcende. Quelque chose comme ça, justement, de transcender sa propre nature à travers ça. Et en fait, ce que je me demandais, tout simplement, justement, c'est que j'ai la sensation que, même si l'athéisme est moribond, comme vous me le faites espérer, où est cette parole, en fait, où est cette parole qui appelle la transcendance, justement, de cette forme de transcendance, ce renouveau métaphysique? Où est-ce qu'on peut la trouver? C'est ça, en fait.
Thank you so much. Well, we are in an English-speaking institution. Yeah. I feel sort of compelled to answer even a question asked in French in some sort of English. Well, I would hate by giving the impression that I am preaching in favor of anything. This is not the part that a philosopher has to play. A philosopher is supposed to describe reality and to, let's say, to uncover the logic of its development. I'm simply trying to point out that the inner logic of what I call the modern project, which I could call by other names. Some historians of thought coined the phrase of exclusive humanism. Exclusive humanism, i.e., well, man is to be promoted, defended, but not, and there is nothing above man. And when I say that the inner logic of exclusive theism leads to the lack of any external reference point from an external point, the outlook of which could be positive, possibly even negative, on man, but that could be legitimate. Man's judgment on man has no worth. We don't judge a person by asking him or her, what kind of fellow do you think you are? And we will get, in any case, either a positive answer or a negative answer. If we get a negative answer, we will have to ask, well, why are you still there? If you are that bad, well, please, the way out is there. Or, to quote once again an utterance by Seneca, I'm afraid I don't remember where he said that, the way out is everywhere. He was alluding to the Stoic, and Stoicism is, to quote a beautiful phrase by Baudelaire, the religion whose only sacrament is suicide. The religion whose only sacrament is suicide. That's quite well formulated. Well, if we admit this, we'll have, in fact, and I come back to your question, we'll have, in fact, to, not to plead in favor of metaphysics, but simply to show that something like a relationship to transcendence, and for this the word metaphysics might be apposite. Why shouldn't we call that metaphysics? I did that in my last booklet. But what I mean is not metaphysics as a field of philosophy, like logics, aesthetics, ethics, and so on. What I mean is this living relationship to transcendence, where the way we can grasp something that lies outside of the realm, outside of the human ken, and that can give the human species a prop or a ground in the two senses of the word. Well, the question whether theism lies on its deathbed, well, that's a question for sociologists, and sociologists probably would say no. They'd say no. I began with, playing the part of the advocatus diaboli by showing that, well, there are things that are very much to the credit of atheism, atheism understood as a neutrality towards any religious claim, and that could very well ensure a good future to atheism. What I am claiming as a philosopher and not as a sociologist is that atheism could go further, could keep existing as long as it remains inconsequent. And I'm thinking, there's a French thinker who is now probably rightly forgotten, from the early 20th century. He was a biologist and, well, had a smattering of philosophy. His name was doesnt, L-E-D-A-N-T-E-C. Breton, from Britain as the name has it. And he wrote a small book by the title of Atheism. And in this, in this book, he develops very much the same kind of argument that we have just been developing, i.e., the logical consequences of atheism is the disappearance of mankind. And he wrote that in 1907, and as a confirmed unbeliever, as a militant atheist. And then he adds, fortunately, he doesn't say thank God, fortunately, I feel in myself, the inheritance of former generations, that grew in Brittany, i.e. in a country steeped in popular Catholicism, that give me an inheritance that gives me moral principles, and I abide by those moral principles, although I full well know that they are prejudices. Well, is such an attitude able to is it sustainable, as the idiom has it, is it sustainable in the long run? Personally, I would doubt that. But, okay, that's my opinion.
Is there another question?
So just to make sure your question is more or less like, why should humans continue to exist, right? So I'm going to have to kind of agree with the graffiti artist there, because like humans, like the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years.
Mm-hmm.
Humans have been around for like 50,000 of those years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like species come and go all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how it is.
Well, let me. Okay, well, first, there are some biologists who claim that species have a definite lifespan.
About 1 million years.
Never mind. There's a definite lifespan, and well, it so happens that, well, if this is true, man should, human beings, human species should live on for quite a bit. That's my first point. The second point is that, well, there have been human beings for quite a long time, but we should always keep in mind that the survival of this species depends wholly on the present generation. It's totally indifferent whether there have been human beings for 1 million or 1 billion years. That's just for the sake of argument. What is important is that everything will go on if mankind reproduces itself in a span of 40 years. I mean, the whole building, the huge building of the human species rests upon a very thin needle, 40 years. And people have been cognizant of that for centuries. There's a sonnet, Shakespeare, who had this boy friend, and who encouraged him to marry, to beget children. For if not, says Shakespeare, 80 years will do the world away, something like that. There is the equivalent of that, well, in French literature, in this medieval romance, the Roman de la Rose. And, well, this is obvious. This is obvious. If we stop begetting children for 40 years, well, no woman will be left who could bear any. Okay, and we'll have to call it a day. And for this reason, we should not be intoxicated by those big figures, millions of years and so on and so forth. This is very true. There have been, well, homines sapientes for X centuries. I don't know exactly. That's not important. But everything depends on the present. To some extent, only the present is real. The past is by, and the future depends on us. Which, well, this is very interesting for a philosopher. Let's say an ethical question. Ethics deals with action, not with what happened in the past, only indirectly, that could happen in the future, or there will be a future if we decide right now. Okay, well, perhaps should I?
What does that have to do with atheism?
Well, perhaps I should repeat my if we had no good reason to beget children, i.e., let me well, I wanted to have something to read on the plane. And it so happened that I had never read Byron. Okay, I feel ashamed. And well, there's this, I discovered that then, 3 days ago. Lucifer is speaking to Cain. You know, I have to raise Cain in order to answer your question. But in this piece, Cain, a mystery that he wrote in 1821, there's a dialogue between Lucifer and Cain. And Lucifer, is debunking mankind, which is a lofty mind chained in a body made of mud and things. It's the old Gnostic and Platonic, but up to a point, theme. And he's alluding to sexual pleasure. The very best of thine enjoyments, that's sex, is a sweet degradation, a most enervating and filthy cheat to lure thee on to the renewal of fresh souls and bodies, all foredoomed to be as frail and few so happy. And Cain answers, here let me, I skip some lines, here let me die, for to give birth to those who can but suffer many years and die, methinks is merely propagating death and multiplying murder. When we beget a child, we beget a mortal being. We condemn somebody to die, and we are hardly sure that the happiness that this being can enjoy can be a balanced weight to, whatever kind of torture, illness, things that he or she can suffer. And if we have not something to tip the scales in favor of being over nothingness, and this is something that I call God, but then we are not yet out of the woods, and we even are in a fine predicament. Well, let's say, that's an old question. 1821, 3 years after Schopenhauer's Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, who tried, as I told you, to show that sexual pleasure is a cheat. I was surprised when I read that. And if, let's say life as a blind force plays these kind of tricks with us, why should we go on? If we are the result of blind forces, why should we go on doing freely and rationally what produced us unfreely and irrationally? Sorry.
Maybe if we cannot answer, you can still say let's eat and drink. So we all welcome you for the cheese and wine now, and we warmly thank you, Professor Brague, for your lecture.